Foreign direct investment driving development. Sustainable growth through knowledge transfer. Technology as a solution. Innovation as a way forward. Over 70 ministers, 140 countries, over 500 exhibitors, 8,000 square meters of exhibition, 15,000 businessmen and investors. The annual investment meeting, Sustainable Development through FDI-induced innovation and technology transfer.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to everybody. Your Excellencies, Honourable Ministers, Honourable Chief Minister, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the next plenary session. What we aim to be covering in this session is really looking at the development of high-end industries and the underlying factors that led to development of these industries in both the Asian tigers and China. What I then plan to do is really to open it up and look a bit more globally to what happened particularly in India, and more importantly, what lessons we can draw from this that you in this room can apply in other regions of the world. So I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel of speakers here coming from a wide variety of sectors and a wide variety of disciplines. I'm going to start right over at my far left. We're joined here by Mr. Alexander Wu. Alexander is the chairman of China Power and New Energy Development Company. This company is mainly engaged in wind power, biomass, and other new energy, covering both domestic and foreign markets. The company is aiming to become a leader in the field of new energy. Next to Mr. Wu, we have Henry Lovendall. Henry has nearly 20 years' experience in FDI data, technology, and consulting. He previously worked for PwC, IBM, and then the Financial Times. In 2010, Henry established WavTech in Hong Kong, which has expanded across China, Japan, Korea, and India. And his company helped secure the largest ever Chinese FDI project in the US. Henry has a master's degree focused on East Asian economic development and the role of FDI, and a PhD on Japanese FDI and economic development. Next to Henry, we have Andrea Stressler. Andrea Stressler is the Managing Director of Conway Advisory and has been active in the foreign direct investment field for 18 years. He works with companies to develop both their international expansion strategies, select the best locations for their operations, and to implement cross-border investment projects. He also assists countries, regions, and cities to promote themselves internationally and attract foreign direct investment, and is a sought-after speaker on the topic of FDI. Next to Andreas, next to me here, I have the Honourable Minister, Honourable Chief Minister of Kerala, Mr. Oommen Chandy. He's a passionate leader with a desire to create change. Mr. Chandy has put in place major initiatives including Varapadam Transshipment Terminal, Vizinjam Port, Smart City, Metro Rail, Capital City Development, Kerala State Transport Project, and Kannur International Airport, and Trivandrum International Airport. His current focus is on implementing e-governance in the state, and this is notable through the development of several high-profile technology parks. To my immediate left, I'm joined by Mr. Robert Hine, who is the co-founder and CEO of 004 GmbH, a full-service e-commerce provider headquartered in Aschaffenburg in Germany, with activities in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. During his time in 004, Robert has also co-founded a number of enterprises in the e-commerce and technology space. Prior to 004, Robert was co-founder and CEO of Electronica 24 GmbH, one of Germany's first online electronic retailers. Next to Mr. Hine, we have Mr. Jamal Al-Jawan. Jamal joined the UAE International Investors Council in November 2014 as Secretary General. Mr. Al-Jawan started his career in Etisalat in 1988 and in 1996 he joined Turaya Telecommunications Company before rejoining Etisalat. Mr. Al-Jawan has a total of 25 years experience in telecoms, investments and business development. He served as a board member for several of the Etisalat's international subsidiaries. His major achievements include launching Turaya mobile satellite system in 100 countries and securing the third GSM license in Egypt, and finally an acquisition of an existing third-party operator in Sri Lanka. Next to Mr. Al-Jawan, we have Dr. Professor Shen Mingao. Dr. Mingao is the Professor of International Economics and the researcher of the GRIIS and Director of Cantonese Merchants Research Center. He is the Chairman of the Forum of the Los Angeles Asia-Pacific Research Exchanges and Teacher Development. His research areas include international economics, business mode, enterprise innovation, and entrepreneurship, business group comparison and corporate governance, global trade, and business network evolution. Finally, and last but not least, we have Mr. Matthew Sumner. Matthew Sumner is the Standing Director of Asia for MX Media Group, the parent company of the China-based Invest-In and China Offshore brands. These two media brands, built from the ground up starting in 2008, are China's first full-service media and events platform for Chinese investors, high net worth individuals seeking information and opportunities for both outbound investment and offshore wealth management. Matthew, fortunately, is also fluent in Mandarin Chinese as well, so may well be helping me through this panel. So first up, I would like to introduce Mr. Al-Jawan to provide a quick keynote on this important topic.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and I really appreciate the attendance for this session. I'm pleased to give the keynote, and I was thinking of what would be the keynote speech. Probably not most of you have heard of the UAE International Investor Councils. This has just recently been launched, as you've seen yesterday in the opening ceremony with His Excellency the Minister, Engineer Sultan al-Mansouri, Minister of Economy, launching the council. As you see, UAE has really considered to be long in terms of investment started back in the 70s through the creation of Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, ADIA. And since then, UAE has really taken a very strategic and courageous move to invest abroad. So we are about 35, 40 years old in terms of investments, which really can be anchored and started by ADIA, and then the rest of the UAE-based companies who have taken major investment abroad. The recent decision taken by the cabinet back in 2009 is to create this council. Basically, the root cause and the reason for creating this council is not so many in the world today where you see council representing a group of investors. There's very few, according to my information, but in UAE, this has become necessary. We've seen the number of sovereign wealth fund being a telecom company, being a port authority, being a private business, family-oriented. There was pressing need to create this council to consolidate effort and coordinate activities abroad. The main purpose of the council is basically to support UAE-based companies who have invested abroad, and trying to, mainly the council is representing these council members, finding investment opportunities for them and coordinating with the various governmental bodies to resolve their issues faced abroad. The role of the council basically is more of representation and coordination with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, and Ministry of International Cooperation and Development. So it's become a central point of contact for our council members to coordinate participation abroad, either through joint committees, government-to-government discussion, and single representation on behalf of the council member, like as we see in this AIM gathering. Who are the members in the council? It is a semi-government. The chairman of the council is the Minister of Economy, and membership of course, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Finance, Abu Dhabi Investment Company, Abu Dhabi National Energy Company, TAQA, Al Fahim Group, Buruj Private Limited, which owned by ADNOC, DB World, Emirates Telecommunication Corporation, Ittisalat, I'mar, General Civil Aviation Authority, Majid Al Ftaim Group, Mubadala, Thani Investment. This is the start. Of course, we have other members will be joining as well the council as we roll the council for the next stage. Of course, the Article of Association has been also finalized. The idea is to set the pace and the rules that govern this council. So the article stipulates that the chairman of this council is the Minister of Economy. The board term is for 3 years, and then re-election. The value add, I have touched base very quickly in the introduction note. Basically, the value add of the council is central point of contact and international representation, central point of coordination with various stakeholders, i.e. government and non-governmental organization, assist in overcoming investment challenges faced by the council member abroad. Establishing meeting platform to exchange views and form a joint view on international investments. Identify investment opportunities is also part of the council mandate, and participate in executing the UAE international investment strategy. Maintaining central database about international investments and participate in international conferences and forums. This is very quick note, and I thought it's an opportunity for the UAE International, since it was launched yesterday, and give the audience as well a very brief, quick about the council, who are we and what's our role. And I thank you and looking forward to the discussion the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Just give us a brief overview, to the audience here, of what was really the drivers behind that.
Yeah, thanks very much, David. So yes, you asked me to give a brief kind of maybe historic background to East Asian development and the role of FDI. I think probably a good way, in some ways, also a sad way to start would be, the state funeral in Singapore last week of the kind of founder and the president and leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. I'm sure you all have seen that, and maybe even some of you ministers, went to Singapore. So, in many ways, Lee Kuan Yew was really the founder of the East Asian model of economic development, and has had an enormous impact on the model of economic development taken not just by Singapore, but by China, by other countries in the region. So I think if you really want to understand what East Asia did, what their kind of state-led model of economic development, and also the political model as well, is Singapore is and the amazing achievements of Lee Kuan Yew is a good place to look at, to start from. Just in terms of the achievements of Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea, the four tiger economies as they were known at the time. I mean, from the 1950s to 1980s, their economies grew by 10% per annum, at kind of China-level growth rates. It was an export-led development model from that period, with 20% per annum growth in exports. They reduced by the 1970s unemployment and poverty to practically zero levels. It's a phenomenal developmental achievement. Interestingly, Hong Kong and Singapore, by 1994, they were richer per capita than Japan. I'll talk in a minute that Japan had a big influence as well on their economic development. By 94, they were richer than Japan. By the 2000s, Singapore was richer than almost every other developed economy in the world. So how did they achieve this? What were the models of development and the role of FDI? So they were quite different. I think Singapore, is probably in many ways kind of similar to Dubai, that it positioned itself as the regional hub, and FDI played and still plays a critical role in development. Likewise in Hong Kong, whereas if you look at the much larger economies of Taiwan and Korea, FDI had a much more limited role in their development. If you look at how they managed to achieve economic development, I think it's kind of unique, the East Asia model, not just because of the strong role of the state in guiding the economy, but also because they had three big powers at various points in history, which were really central to economic development. You had, first of all, Japan, you had the US, and then now you have China, which have all been huge sources of economic development in the region. If you look at, say, Korea and Taiwan, and you look at the role of the US, it had such a huge role in their development process. If you look at from the 50s to the 60s in Korea and Taiwan, 80% of their imports, 80% of their total investment in the economy was financed by the US. So they adopted, similar to the rest of the developing world at the time, the import substitution model, where they tried to close their economies, focus on building domestic industries, and restricting FDI. In Latin America, we saw that led to the debt crisis of the 80s and economic kind of meltdown there. Whereas in Asia, the US financed the development there, especially in Korea and Taiwan. So that kind of the diplomatic relations with the US and Singapore as well played that very cleverly in terms of balancing China on the one side and the US on the other for its economic development. Were really, really critical. If you look at the role of the government and how they attracted FDI and how they used FDI, it's really interesting again to look at Korea and Taiwan. In Korea, the strategy was to build the chaebol, the huge conglomerate companies like Samsung, Hyundai, world leaders today. And in fact, until the 1980s, FDI was actually restricted, and still now has only a marginal importance in terms of dollar terms. The government controlled the banks, it controlled the unions, it could finance the companies, and they only allowed foreign direct investment if that capability was not available locally, or if it led to joint ventures with technology transfer and training. And then foreign investors were brought in. And then later on, what the Korean government did, it gave loans to the Korean partners to buy out the foreign partners to create Korean champions. So it really was a state-led industrialization process. If you look at Taiwan, they followed a similar approach, and they controlled the banking system as well, so they could support export-led industries from the 60s. FDI was practically zero in Taiwan in the 50s. And never has FDI in Taiwan exceeded more than 10% of investment, whereas in Hong Kong and Singapore, it's over 100%. So it's a completely different opposite model. The Taiwanese government also, we'll hear from India shortly, they established one of the first science parks in the world. Hsinchu Science Park was established in 1980. The Taiwanese government created kind of world-leading research institutes, and they created the Taiwanese semiconductor companies like TSMC, which are world-leading semiconductor players. So you can see the role of FDI is very different, and I think looking at the Asian development, there's quite a lot of lessons you can learn. One is the role of the state in creating the strategy, the capability to absorb FDI, to absorb technology like research institutes, technology parks, supporting local companies. And then it's really looking at the international context. Singapore especially, but also Hong Kong, was so clever, so smart in building Singapore as a regional hub for the whole of ASEAN region. And in many cases, the whole of Asia Pacific, and Hong Kong likewise built itself up as the gateway to export to the United States and to Europe, and then later on as the gateway to China. So they kind of understood the international context and leveraged that for investment success. And then, not least, also is the focus on education. which has been huge in all the countries in Asia. I mean, I just looked at the latest rankings. I mean, the OECD, they rank the education performance of students, of school kids. In 2012, the latest year, the country or city with the highest education levels in the world was Shanghai. The ranking is Shanghai, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Macau, and Japan. They have the highest school-level education results in the world. They're all from East Asia. If you look at Pearson, which owns the Financial Times Group, the world's biggest education provider, they rank the educational levels of countries. In 2014, the top countries in the world for education, according to Pearson, were South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. So again, all the same East Asian countries. So, I mean, I think for any other country in the world looking at how to develop the economy, attract FDI, I mean, education, I think, has to be amongst the #1 policies to look at.
Thank you, Henry. I think that was an excellent overview in terms of providing a bit of background to this discussion. I think it's particularly interesting to look at the role of the state, in particular in terms of shaping that and education, and the fact that that legacy still lives on today, I think is quite an important lesson for us all here. What I want to do now is perhaps turn our attention a little bit towards China. I think what would be quite useful, Professor Mingao, is to get a bit of a brief overview from your side in terms of what's driven China. What's changed? What was so special about what they put in place? Were there similar lessons that were taken from the other Asian tigers that they copied, or was it a completely different model?
好，感谢会议组织者给我们这样一个机会来参与这个讨论。刚才这个亨瑞提到了东亚的模式。实际上这个大家也会注意到，东亚的模式政府发挥的作用呢是确实是不同一般的。中国实际上我们这个观察和这个研究的结果呢，实际上中国政府在整个产业发展当中呢，发挥了至少有5个方面的作用。比方说这是技术吸收和转让，要素的组织，还有这个。
Sorry, Professor Mingao. I think we've got a problem with the translation at the moment. Is it working now? Okay, yeah, we can hear you now. Sorry, please continue.
包括大规模制造的能力，等等5个方面。实际上技术引进，我们中国的发展呢，应该讲从上个世纪80年代初开始，改革开放。那个时候正好是产业的第3次转移的浪潮，也就是很多的从日本、台湾、南韩等这些国家地区，他们在向成本更低的地方转移这个技术和产业，而中国在那个时候呢，正好是承接了大量的这样的一个转移。当时的技术转移呢，实际上政府呢，发挥了比较高效的一个作用。因为当时这个我们承接的技术是已经经过发达国家和地区无数次的市场验证，这些技术是比较成熟的。我们都知道，像高速公路、铁路、钢铁厂、等等这些飞机场，这些都是能够带来经济增长的，它的技术合理性都非常强，所以我们可以完全的全盘接受过来，这样呢是快速的吸收技术。来积累我们的知识和经验。第二个方面就是关于要素组织能力。实际上中国当时的这个要素成本、劳动力成本来讲呢，就是比东南亚还是低低一半甚至更多。但是光有劳动力成本低实际上还不够。中国的最显著的一个优势在于它能够低成本的把各种要素，包括土地、资本、劳动力，低成本的结合在一起，高效率的使用。这是中国政府的一个优势，所以我们建立了很多开发区高新技术园区，吸引外资，然后把劳动力解放出来，从这个大量的这个劳动力和这个资本结合，发展我们的这个产业，这是第2个方面。第3个方面就是关于这个大规模制造的问题。实际上大规模的制造能力，应该是含2个方面的内容，就是第一个就是 你要有大量的高素质的劳动力。而中国实际上在7、8年刚改革开放的时候呢，我们1年招收的大学生只有30万左右，而到了2014年的时候，我们1年毕业的大学生是达到730万，就是将近有20多倍的增长。而且这730万也仅仅是当年新增就业人口的不到一半，也就意味着是中国每年会新增就业人口1500万左右。这1500万的人呢，实际上都是受过10年以上的教育水平的，都受过10年以上的教育水平。那实际上这些10年以上教育水平，恰恰就是可以支持我们的产业发展的。我们的一些外商投资企业和一些相对制造水平相对高一点的产业，它需要这方面的人去进行生产。所以这几个方面都是中国这个这是教育方面。而且我们中国的教育呢，中国的教育培养出的人才呢，还好，用经济学的术语来讲，就是我们的教育培养的人呢，实际上是高均值，低方差。高均值什么意思呢？就是我们的培养的人呢，基本上我们的标准化的这个培养，基本上这个平均水平还是比较高的，比较高。但是低方差就是我们可能这个差异呢不会太大。比方说我们可能获诺贝尔奖的人很少啊，这个但是我们也不会有很大的这个很低的这个，也不会有很低的这个水平。所以这样的一个劳动力的队伍，实际上非常适合这个做大规模量产的工业的一个生产。第二个因素呢，就是关于这个产业集群。实际上，中国的这个政府呢，它的发展模式呢，各个地方政府，我们叫做县域经济，实际上有一个锦标赛的一个考核机制，就是地方政府的官员，他都对当地的经济考核呢负有一定的责任，所以他都通过各种办法去激励当地的这个产业发展。所以这个刚刚改革开放之初呢，就很多的外资进来之后，由于中国的这个传统文化，就是我们都是一开始就是血缘、亲缘、地缘的这种关系呢，更容易产生信任，所以在当时的很多地方，一个村一个镇会产生一整片的这个同一个产业的集群，同一个产业。那这个实际上也是带来了后来很大的这个一个影响。比方说这个现在我们讲中国这个钢铁产量居世界第一，我们讲中国是这个前3位的钢铁产量的地方，中国排第1，河北第2，唐山第3。但实际上唐山呢是河北的一个市，河北省呢是中国的一个省，就是说这样的非常集中。像这个珠三角地区，东莞的 IT 产业，虎门的服装，还有这个中山的什么灯饰，这些地方都形成了相当具规模的一定的产业集群，而且他们的产量都占全世界的1半甚至更高。所以我们经常有句话叫做以前叫东莞塞车，全球缺货，就像鼠标等等这样的产品。另外一个就是关于这个现在这个我们中国的要素成本开始越来越高了。前面我讲过，中国以前这个刚改革开放的时候，中国的劳动力成本是东南亚的1半甚至是1/3。但是经过30年的发展，我们以年均10%的速度在增长。现在我们中国的劳动力的工资的水平是东盟国家除了新加坡、马来西亚东盟是我们的劳动力成本是东盟国家的2到3倍。所以这个时候中国面临的一个问题就是要素成本在不断上升，你的产业的附加值一定要增加。所以我们在之前的发展30年的基础发展的基础上，要注重这个往高端的附加值的产业去进军。而且刚才我讲的所有的因素，包括这个我们的教育，包括我们的这个大规模生产的制造能力，已经使中国具备了这样的一个基础就是可以发展更高端的产业。所以现在这个要讲的就最后一个就是产业政策。我们中国包括这个整个东亚，它非常注重这个产业政策的这个影响，政府发挥作用在这方面是非常多的。像中国一开始呢，实际上对产业政策，尤其是这个聚焦于这个高科技产业怎么样扶持和鼓励。当然我这里指的高科技产业呢，是 要因时因地而异啊，因为时间和这个地点可能不一样，不一样。像这个100多年前的高科技产业可能是纺织业啊，但今天的高科技产业可能就是互联网、工业4.0啊等等这样的产业。所以中国在不同的时间点，它都采用了不同的产业政策的激励，比方说今天我们讲这个要改革开放，要更进一步的开放，我们可能要注重这个是高端的服务业，的一些鼓励。还有另外一个比较重要的方面就是关于基础设施建设，这也是中国比较有显著的差异的一个地方。我们知道中国这个基础设施建设就是从硬件来讲，中国比很多这个沿海城市比很多发达国家也都是不逊色。硬件来讲，硬件设施非常好。这个是一方面，就是我前面讲的，因为你县域经济，各个地方政府呢要把经济搞好，这是一方面的刺激。另外一方面就是中国政府对于这个宏观经济的调控，它拉动内需增长，拉动需求增长，三驾马车，一个是消费，一个是出口，一个是投资，这三个呢它可以灵活的运用。比方说我们出口，比方说金融危机的时候，出口我们不太好的时候，我们的消费需求呢又不可能短期内翻，这时候我们利用了这个投资的方式。比方说97年、98年亚洲金融危机的时候，中国利用这个时间呢，进行了大规模的基础设施建设投资，建设了当时全国的高速公路网。08年，再比如08年到09年，全球金融危机的时候，我们中国呢又利用当时的机会呢，建设了全国的高铁、高速铁路的网络，还有这个全新的一个机场的网络。那今天实际上我们中国实际上还是在这方面呢，在推动一些基础设施建设，因为现在都讲这个区域经济体化，中国现在就提出了"一带一路"的建设，实际上是为了让整个东门包括"一带一路"沿线的国家的基础设施做一个更好的一个改善。这也是他在用投资的方式来拉动经济增长的一个举措。所以我想就是通过就大概是5个方面，中国呢实际上是在为将来的产业发展奠定了一定的基础。这是我想说的，谢谢。
Thank you, Professor Mingao. I think that was a very interesting and insightful overview in terms of what's been happening over in China. I guess what I'd like to do now is really push it on to their Go Global policy, which I think is an interesting one in itself. Obviously, China's gone through some rapid development over the last 20, 30 years, as you just outlined. Perhaps if I could, I'd like to go to Matthew Sumner just to give us a bit more of an insight from his understanding in terms of what's happening in the market, particularly related to the Go Global, and what does that mean for people in the audience in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, David. So first of all, Mr. Shen, I think you did a very good job in bringing us up to where we are today in terms of China's standing in the world, the number of industries and technologies that it's been able to import, and how it's positioned itself in the world economy to start competing for high-end manufacturing, biotechnology, these other industries which are much more high-end than those industries that Western countries in America compete on a global scale. So just a brief history of time. I mean, we've been following the China outbound investment policy and the trend since around 2008, which is basically the first time that China's National Development Reform Council provided provisions on the approval of outbound investment projects. And this came at the perfect time, just before the financial crisis, which allowed China to then strategically and very much a very well thought out and a very incremental expansion strategy to go out and acquire resources that the country needed to fuel its economic growth. And this also came at a time when many of the Western economies and other economies were absolutely starved for cash. So as he rightly pointed out, this is a huge opportunity to acquire technologies and also acquire resources. Now, just a year after that, in 2009, the Ministry of Commerce, they released the administrative measures for domestic entities outbound investment. The third body, which is very important in this whole trend, is the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, which basically regulates currencies, foreign currencies moving in and out of China. And they also released administrative measures for foreign exchange administration for the domestic entities investing overseas. Now, we all know that China's currency, the renminbi, is not a freely traded currency. But in January 11th, we already began to see signs that it was China's intention to make its currency, to increase the value of the currency, and also make it one that could be used in trade, and then later on in investment. And this happened with the launch of the Overseas Direct Investment Fund in 2011. Now, at the very time of the first policy, China's total outbound direct investment in the year of 2008 was only $26.5 billion. $26.5 billion. In 2012, only 4 years later, China's outbound investment had already reached $84.2 billion, more than 3 times the amount just 4 years later. Now, since that time, China's outbound investment has been growing rapidly, and a lot of this has to do with not only the government and their policies for relaxation of capital controls, and also their desire to acquire resources abroad, and not only that, but technology abroad. We were talking about inward technology transfer. China is now obviously going out and looking for technology that they can acquire to further develop their industries. Now, a little bit of a fast forward to where we are today. As of last year, China had now relaxed the capital controls to a point where an individual corporation could invest up to $300 million overseas without the approval, without prior approval. This is a fundamental shift in how China has traditionally dealt with outbound investment. So anyone who's sitting in the audience and trying to understand exactly where China stands on the world stage, it has gone from a very insignificant source of FDI at only 26.5 billion in 2008 to now in 2014 at approximately 116 billion in outbound investment. This now makes it number 3 in the world and number 2 if you include Hong Kong, which is usually the first step in many Chinese outbound investments due to its very attractive tax regime and the very lax capital controls. So this should also mark 2015 and 2016 should also be the first year in the history of China where its outbound investment will exceed its inbound investment. So if that's any indicator of where China is going in terms of its global expansion strategy, I think that says it all.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think that's a really interesting point there. I think that many of you should take notice of, is the fact that Chinese outward FDI could potentially surpass their inward FDI this year. That's a staggering change in terms of, go back 5 years or so, investment was just purely piling into China. We just heard the numbers there to see how that's grown exponentially. What will be quite interesting now is to actually turn to Andrea Stressler here and really look at from a greenfield perspective. I'm going to turn to you afterwards, Mr. Wu, to understand your company's perspective, but really from a greenfield perspective, what are the drivers? What are the kind of characteristics that these Chinese companies are looking for when they're investing overseas?
Well, thanks, David. I think we need to take maybe a couple of steps back and try and dissect the numbers that Matthew was mentioning. I think of the 80 billion, I don't have the exact figures, but I would presume a lot of that is investment into infrastructure, Chinese companies going to Africa, Middle East, and then putting a lot of money into infrastructure projects. If you look at Chinese investment into places such as Western Europe, or increasingly now the United States, most of that is still through acquisitions. So Chinese companies have, again, opportunistically, as a result of the financial crisis, been able to pick up some really attractive assets, companies in a variety of industries, from automotive through the construction industry to electronics, and have been able to buy those companies in Germany and France and Italy and the US for, I'd say, fairly good prices. What's interesting in the context of this discussion, there was a great fear when this Chinese wave started coming, and there was a great concern that the Chinese companies would really strip out the intellectual property, take it back to China, and keep it there. But there have been studies showing that the contrary, the opposite has happened. Chinese companies have actually come in, bought European companies, bought US companies, and invested. They've grown those companies, they've put capital in those companies, they've helped those companies access new markets. They've actually contributed to the strength of those companies. So that's the acquisition side. On the greenfield side, that's still a rarity. So it's still relatively seldom that you find a Chinese company that is willing to come into, especially an established place like Europe or the US, and set up a greenfield facility. I've worked with a few of them, and the drivers tend to be a little different and almost contrasting or conflicting. So I'll give you an example of a company I worked with, a privately held Chinese company that is one of the market leaders in packaging. And this company wanted to build a facility, a manufacturing plant in Europe, so they didn't want to buy anyone. Their plan was explicitly to build their own plant. The driver was not technology. They had great technology. The driver was really market access. It was customer proximity. And the biggest driver was really recognition. So they ended up picking Germany as the place to build the plant. So they ended up picking possibly the most expensive country in Europe to do that. But the driver really was they wanted to be recognized as a quality brand, as a quality company. Now the paradox is once they picked Germany, all of a sudden cost became the biggest driver. So all of a sudden within Germany, the big focus was on where can we get the lowest labor costs, where can we secure low-cost land, where can the government provide incentives. So you almost had these paradoxical drivers of seeking quality, but also being very cost-conscious, and that's something I've seen repeat itself recently in the US. There have been examples recently of Chinese companies in the paper industry, Chinese companies in the automotive industry, setting up in the US, again for market access reasons. And then once they've focused on the US as a market, really being very keen on finding low-cost locations, and maybe a reflection of what they're used to from home, a lot of government support. That's really something that they're keen on finding.
I think that's a very interesting comment you've added in there. I mean, I think it wasn't that long ago. I think many people were asking the question of when are we going to see a global Chinese brand? So the need to kind of go somewhere where it gives them integrity, gives them quality, recognition, certainly makes sense, as well as then the cost indicators that go with that.
David,
I think I'd like to turn now really to, I mean, obviously time is very tight with so many speakers, so I'd like to turn now to Mr. Alexander Wu to really give us a bit of an insight from his perspective. You know, obviously you're as a growing Chinese company, you have aspirations to become a leader in the new energy field. I'm really keen really to understand from you, what are the key drivers, you know, if you could relate that to technology transfer as well, I think that would be really appreciated from the audience.
首先我觉得中国的发展经过了30年的这个高速发展，这30年中平均的这个 GDP 的增长速度都超过了10%，这样的呢积累了大量的这个资金、技术、管理的经验，也同时呢也有能力能生产能够服务全球的这个新能源的产品。我想在说这个之前呢，想跟大家分享几个数据。首先，这个中国用了5年不到的时间，这个就夺回了全球风电排行榜的第1，也就是说，中国人用了5年的时间干了全世界30年干的风电。这是其中第一个数字。第二个数字是中国目前现在在运转的单台装机容量在兆瓦级的，也就是1000千瓦以上的，大概有10万台。这也是全球最大的一个保有的市场。当然，除了这个新能源方面，除了风能，还有太阳能，还有光热。中国在这几个方面，在目前全球的保有量依旧是全球第1。除了这个产品的制造能力以外，这个在运营的这些新能源的电厂和新能源的设施，也培养和积累了大量的管理人员。同时，中国在改革开放以后的这30年积累了大量的资本，它有要去国外投资的这个冲动和欲望。同时呢，这个中国政府也鼓励中国的企业走向海外，去投资海外。就像今天上午我们也拜访了迪拜的水利部的部长和这个投促局的局长，我们也在谈论在迪拜来投资200到300兆的这个新能源，来供给这个迪拜高速增长的经济所需要的电力。 这中间呢，就说明一个什么问题呢？中国这个是一直前20-30年是一直在低头做自己家里的事。这个最明显的一个例子，中国大概在12年的时候，就是已经实现了吸收外资和对外投资平衡的这么一个节点了。因为这个迪拜和中亚跟我们有地缘的关系，所以中国的企业投资的第一站有可能尤其是电力方面的，可能就会先考虑到迪拜，因为有很多的中国的企业，生产企业已经在迪拜落户了，所以呢，这是有良好的技术条件的。我想从另外一个方面来分享一下这个中国的新能源的发展对这个迪拜当前经济的一些合作的空间。这个随着人类的这个不断的往前的进步和发展，以及全球以人为本理念的这个不断的这个深化，也其中也包括大家对绿色这个地球的这个渴望和保护地球的这个意识的增强。我们觉得新能源可能在未来的这个相当长一段时间里面，这个在整个电力供应这个体系里面的比重会越来越高，这也是全球人类的这个发展的趋势。这样的呢，也为我们的这个新能源企业提供了很多很多的这样的机遇。我们也希望有机会，能够跟迪拜，能够中东的国家，我们一起来合作新能源的事业。谢谢。
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. That was a very interesting model in terms of the way that you're looking to push ahead with your business. I think the aspirations of the Chinese to take such a key role in the future of new energy is also an interesting development we'll watch unfold over the coming years. What I'd like to do now is really turn attention more towards other markets. In particular, I think we're delighted here to be joined by the Honourable Chief Minister of Kerala State in India. Obviously, there's been quite a lot of talk about who's going to win the race for the future. Is it going to be India or China? So what I'd like to do is really open the floor to you, first of all, to give a few opening remarks, and then we can look a bit more in detail at what's happening within India and what the opportunities are. So over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Before my response to the question, I would like to take 2-3 minutes as introduction. During the last 50 years or more, a large number of our people had migrated to UAE as well as the region. They include professionals like doctors, engineers, nurses, teachers, and other skilled and unskilled workers. The UAE has also been very gracious to this migrant workforce and had always recognized and appreciated their contribution for nation building. I am very thankful to the rulers of this country for providing an atmosphere of being at home for our people. I would like to particularly mention large investments by way of Smart City project and Vallarvadam container transship terminal, both at Kochi, where significant contribution have been made in our state. Till 2013, India was the biggest trading partner of UAE. Now India stands second position. With the unprecedented growth of IT and other knowledge industries in Kerala, and our program to convert our cities to smart cities, provide ample investment opportunities for the Gulf states for investment and collaborative partnerships. The large mass of educated and trained manpower in Kerala is proof of our human capital that is essential to convert any FDI as well as technology partnership into highly profitable high-end enterprises for prospective investors and multinational groups. The governments of Kerala and India have proactive policies with respect to international investments and collaborations to ensure that bureaucratic delays or any unforeseen changes in the policies do not undermine the confidence of investors. We are now capable of replicating the success formula of Asian tigers, that is a combined model of innovation and disciplined execution. This annual investment meeting 2015 is a great platform for mutual sharing of experience to identify new opportunities and collaborate the common success. I would like to react to the question. While China and other countries focused on hardware and other industries, India used its soft power and made substantial contribution to the global economy by supporting high-end industries in many developed and developing countries by providing superior information technology backbones. Thus, India helped these industries to improve efficiency and reduce cost and thus be competitive. The Indian industry continues to develop capabilities around traditional and emerging markets, verticals and customer segments, expand global delivery presence, and increase focus on high-value service, including product development for global industrial leaders. India is also home to the fourth largest and fast-growing digital startup ecosystem. Mangalyaan experiment was a great success in the first attempt itself, which no other country can do like that. And that too with the cheapest cost. Our scientists will prove wonders in future, we are sure. In Kerala, now we are giving much importance for startup movements, and youngsters are coming. Even the students are coming with their own ideas, and we are giving full support, and we are encouraging, and we are quite sure that the next generation is coming up with a very active way.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think the whole question of the Indian approach is very much different. It wasn't able to capitalize on what was happening so much in East Asia, and had to create its own kind of model. And I think, particularly with those type of segments you've highlighted there was obvious advantages. So looking at how that's kind of benefited the SMEs in your country is quite a key part. I mean, I guess one of the things I understood is that your IT is transforming the lifestyle of Kerala. Can you just very briefly touch on that?
Yes. We are IT. We are the fast developing area is IT.
Yeah.
And we are trying our best to become our state as a digital state. Within days, we are going to announce Kerala state is a digital state. All over India also, we are giving much importance for IT, and IT development is very promising.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, great. I think just looking at the fact that we've got maybe about 10, 15 minutes left, I've still obviously got a big contribution to come from Mr. Hine next to me here. I want to get some insight in terms of what else is happening elsewhere in the world, and particularly we're here in the Middle East right now. So, Robert, from your perspective, obviously you're a company that's been growing in different markets. You're in the US, you're in Europe. You're now looking at, you're within the Middle East. Can you give us a bit of a background in terms of what's really driven that, and what the kind of thought process is from your side, and how that could potentially impact upon the local market?
Yeah, gladly. So for us, looking at a new market, what was really important as a technology company is not only looking where we can sell our product, but looking at where we can develop our product further. So we've taken a somewhat different approach in making our decision on where to invest and where to build up. We've actually looked at markets to say where has technology leapfrogged and structures leapfrogged, where we can evolve and where we can develop something new by creating structures here locally, by teaching the people, by actually recruiting and developing technology here. We think that that's actually the most viable form of technology transfer, to actually go out and look within the market and say, this is technology which fits the market here. For e-commerce, it means looking at mobile technologies here rather than the desktop. It also means looking at different retail structures that we want to support here. So for us, it was very, very important to decide on where are there markets where our technology can come in, but where do we have structures that we can help create? I'd like to say that innovation also very important in the IT services space. So not only in the manufacturing side, but actually the evolution of the markets in the IT services is going to be a big driver. And I think that if countries, and our experience here, if looking into the countries and examining what makes that market unique and then evolving those IT services for the local markets, you're actually going to encourage a large amount of innovation in your own markets rather than depending upon processes and services being predefined in other countries and then just being exported in. So a key element to innovation is going to be on the services side, and having your structures internally from education also be able to develop those new IT services fitting to your market.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. That was very good. Jamal.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with the rest of the speakers, specifically Henry. I think he listed it, the lesson learned very specifically. I agree. I think lesson learned, I would say probably a country, as a firm or an organization, investment is a DNA that need to be there. You need to build it over time. It's a culture. Understanding what's the investment, defining what's investments. It's also important to agree on the definition of an investment. Is it return on investment, or is it strategic? Is it political? Is it geographic? Is it, I believe investment is a great word, but need to be understood and defined correctly and agreed upon within the constituencies. Skills in the investment has to be as well built over time. I think it's not well taught in the schools, in the academy. Education definitely plays a great part in correctly teaching investments, not only a CPA or a CFA or a finance course would do, and I think it's beyond that. Execution, I think a lesson to be learned, execution is key. If you want to execute investment, you cannot second guess it. It has to be 100% correct. I'm sorry, this is the nature of the business. Execution is important with discipline, and I think if you couple execution with discipline, it's definitely, it goes along together. Again, I want to emphasize on the culture and the education. Like in the UAE, investment has been here for many, many years, since the inception of the country. And we've gone far, and we want to go further in investments abroad. And I believe it is a culture need to be built correctly by the legislators, decision makers, policy makers, and the education system. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Mingao.
Okay. 我想说的就是一个国家要发展它的高端产业，可能可以考虑3个步骤。首先第一步就是应当要定位和发现自己的潜在的比较优势产业。怎么做？我想可能应该从你的相似的资源禀赋的国家，但人均工资比自己要高2到3倍的这样的地方去发现它前10年重点发展的产业，这个可能会成为你的潜在的比较优势的产业，因为这意味着你的这个人均工资、人均劳动力成本是最低的。第二步就是发现和扶植在这个产业内的企业， 如果自己国家内部已经有企业进入了这样的一个产业，那应该扶持它、鼓励它。如果没有，那招商引资，利用外资来溢出，发展这个企业。第三步，就是政府应该要做的事，就是要完善各种软件和硬件的基础设施，为这样的一些企业的扩大再生产、扩大规模，去提供便利条件，降低交易成本，这就是我要说的3步。OK。
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Matthew, very quickly, would you like to round off
Yeah,
from the panel's perspective?
I would. Instead of just painting broad strokes, I think in terms of lessons learned, probably one of the most significant being China in its economic development in the past 30 years. There's a very good quote that I found when looking over this topic, and for foreign companies who are operating in industries prioritized by the PRC government, as everyone knows, China has very famous 5-year plans, which they very consistently execute every 5 years. They said that, if these are priority sectors for the Chinese government at that time, you must know that technology transfer is probably the price of getting involved in that industry in the domestic market. At the same time, China is no longer, the currency is no longer cheap compared to other currencies. It's also not a cheap place to operate business. Many of the companies there have already saturated their local markets. So when it comes to technology transfer, they now have both the economic means and the desire to expand internationally. So the paradigm has shifted a little bit where they're going out and buying the technology that they want, both to expand into foreign markets and to serve their own local domestic markets. A very important point. I think one of the things that Henry just said was that in terms of technology transfer, you have to understand the economic landscape. What is the motive behind transferring the technology or acquiring the technology? Who are the people who are involved, which governments are involved, and kind of the dynamic behind all that. That's very important for any corporation considering either buying or transferring technology to another corporation. And I guess finally, something that we didn't talk about is probably knowledge transfer. If you want to talk about the case of India, I was sitting with Invest Philippines, and they were saying how much they admired India because they had gone from a voice outsourcing destination or a business processing outsourced destination to now a knowledge process outsourcing destination, which means that they have been able, through their experience and the support of the government, to move up the value chain, which I think is a very wonderful example of not just pure technology, but the human element of what's required, in any economy's progress. So that's what I'd like to add.
Thank you very much. I think we've got maybe a couple of minutes left. I want to open up to the floor. I mean, obviously, it's all very well and good us talking and sharing our wisdom. What would be really interesting is really take a few questions from the floor and listen to, allow you to put questions to this expert panel. So, have we got any microphones in the audience? First question at the front. 1 second, just behind you there. Thank you.
Considering the risk part of FDI exit or withdrawal, so as per World Bank report, they have already cut the global economical growth for coming 3 to 5 years. So focusing to sustainable economical growth, do you think that new reforms or policies, especially on FDI exit or withdrawal part, is important for Asian countries? And on the other side, also considering the economical growth of US and European Union.
Okay. Shall I take that one, Henry? Yeah, I think you might need to repeat some of that question.
It's actually FDI withdrawal part. The risk on FDI withdrawal.
Free trade agreement withdrawal?
Yeah.
FTA withdrawal?
FDI exit or withdrawal. Is require any policy or?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
No, actually, whenever withdrawing the FDI, foreign direct investments withdrawal from the economies, the threat of that by the investors, investing country, investors, because considering the upcoming economical growth of US or European, is it a threat for Asian countries?
Oh, I think I understand.
Okay.
You mean, is it a threat that European and US companies will leave Asia?
Correct. Yeah, that's
Okay. It would be a threat if they were to leave. I think if they all were to leave simultaneously, it would have a significant impact on Asian economies. It's unlikely to happen because the Asian market has become so important to European and American companies. If you look at companies in Europe, from the biggest multinationals like Siemens to family-owned, medium-sized manufacturing companies, in many cases, the majority, the large share of their revenue comes from Asia. It no longer comes from Europe or North America, it's actually from Asia. So a lot of companies have become dependent on Asia, dependent primarily on China, and the likelihood that they will leave is small. One of the manifestations of that is that China in particular is really increasing pressure on foreign investors, is making, in some instances, in some industries, it quite hard for big foreign companies to be there. Yet foreign companies are adapting the way they do business in China because the market is so important to them. So to answer your question, if they were to leave, it would be a threat, but the likelihood of that happening is relatively small.
The question is whether Asian countries should take any reforms or any other strategy for that, long-term FDA increasing to that. The term.
Yeah, Henry, do you want to answer?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think it really matters. I mean, I think as we've talked about, Asia's become an outward investor more than an inward investor, and that's the real opportunity. If you just look, I've got some great stats here. So if you look at FDI as a percent of total investment last year in Asian countries, in Japan it was 0.2%. It's nothing. In China, it's only 2.9%. So only 2.9% of total investment in China was through FDI last year. I mean, it's tiny, and that's the lowest it's ever been. Every single year it's going down. I mean, China is already a net investor in Europe. Last year, China was the biggest greenfield investor in the United States. It's transformed into an outward investor. In Korea and Taiwan, FDI is less than 4% of domestic investment. So for those kind of core Asian countries, I mean, FDI has become of very limited importance in terms of overall investment.
That is right, especially on India. India is more focusing for FDI now. So this will be a threat for India in future. That's what the question.
For India?
Yep.
Yeah.
His question is irrelevant in a different way, very sorry to say. I want to ask the view of our panelists about the PPP, private-public partnership. I want to know the overall view of the experts. What is the future of the PPP, private-public partnership?
Okay, so you're, sorry, the question you're asking is...
I'm asking the financial experts, what is their view?
On the future of private-public partnerships. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, excellent.
We have. Thank you for the question. Today, if you look into UAE, I'll give you one example. One of the successful partnership between government and private is the incumbent Emirates Telecommunication Corporation Etisalat. 60% is owned by the government, 40% is owned by the private. It has been there for the last 30 years and working perfect. I am pro the concept, the school of thought of where is the public and the private, because the private feel more secure when the public, the government is there. I've seen other examples where also UAE has partnership with the government, where the private has partnered up with the government. You feel the investment is more in safe haven. Who controls, that's a different agenda, who is the majority, and that's between shareholders. But I've seen, according to my experience in Egypt, for example, Etisalat, when they gone and acquired the third license through a tender, they partnership with the post. 20% is the government post. And they are still, and the partnership is doing very well. So I am pro the PPP. I think it's one way of also governments can offer to the private sector, foreign investor. It facilitates the inflow of investment to the country.
So, thank you. I think the Honourable Chief Minister.
For developing countries, according to me, that is a necessary thing. See, the expenditure on the government side is going up, but income is not like that. So for the infrastructure developments and the to keep up the needs of the people, the government, especially in developing countries, find out new ways, that is PPP, BOT, annuity. So many new methods we have to adopt. Otherwise, the development works will suffer, no doubt.
Okay, very quickly.
I have a question here.
To make another.
We actually classified it into different elements. So as soon as a project is strategic and long-term for a region based on other investments which the public sector is making, then we see that as being a very viable and necessary step. In the strictly private sense, so our entering the market here, for example, we had no need for a PPP, but we are already working on projects here which are moving into the strategic and the public area, then it's very necessary.
Thank you. Sorry, just one final question, then we're going to wrap it up for this afternoon. Sorry.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Iyad Abu Hatem. I'm from Amman Chamber of Industry. My question addressed to Mr. Andreas. Knowing that Jordan economy is a very small economy, it's worth of $33 billion, where less than 0.3% of the GDP goes for R&D. What's your advice to policymakers on how to build an effective national innovation system in a very small economy? We're not talking India, we're not talking the Asian tigers. It's a very tiny economy, $33 billion, Jordan. Thank you.
The advice is really to be extremely focused in your approach. And there are good examples of even smaller countries with smaller economies and smaller populations who've picked a niche and have become specialists in something. A good example is Estonia, which is a tiny country with a tiny population that's not exactly blessed with resources or a particularly strategic location, that has picked one thing and one thing only, which is e-government related to cybersecurity. And Estonia has become the worldwide laboratory, the worldwide lab for anything related to technology in government, for anything related to cybersecurity. Those are the fields that it's chosen to excel in. And every aspect of government policy is directed towards increasing innovation in that. So my argument would be to really be selective in terms of picking one thing and being very focused on one thing and doing that better than everybody else.
Can I ask one question, please, here?
Sorry?
Can I ask one question here?
One very quick question, then we're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah, when you are discussing about the investment climate in this region, especially in Asia, what will be the impact of the ongoing situation in this region, especially the mushrooming number of terrorist groups creating problem for not only the general public, but for the governments and the entire region? What will be the impact of this conflict, regional conflicts, on the investment climate in the region? And secondly, you are talking about investment climate in the region. The oil price has come down by almost half within the last 6 months, and there is no uncertainty about the future. So what will be the impact of that in the case of all these Gulf countries?
Do you want to answer? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. No problem. Conflict in the region, I think, the best witness would be, this is a great question, actually. We have all witnessed what happened in Egypt. The undertaking and the amount of investors who have participated and the quality of investment project that's been announced. This is great evidence of that the leadership and the regions are committed to the stabilities. So I think in the long run, in fact, I believe the impact is positive from an investment perspective, because again, at the end of the day, it's a socio-economics issue for the population of this region and the people of the Arab nations. So I believe it will improve, in fact, and there is commitment towards the region, and I haven't, yeah, this is unprecedented. Well, what happened in Egypt is a really case study.
Excellent.
Not only the Arab nations, the whole world showed up there.
Great. I think this is the place where we'll end it today. I think I want to first of all thank the panelists for all their contributions, as well as thanking the organisers, AIM, for putting this important session on. So, if a big round of applause, please, for the panelists and for their contributions.